subject is global health and America's roles in it and American health policy, and we have a very special guest. During the past decade, the topic of global health has taken a prominent role in the health policy debate. That development was propelled by two factors. The first one is that there's concern over infectious diseases that now can easily travel from one continent to another. We might call it a self-interested, a selfish, self-centered type of concern. And the second force driving global health is that the concern in the developed high-income countries over the toll that preventable and treatable diseases takes on the people of the poor developing countries. So in that sense, this is an altruistically driven concern. Our one major player in the growing importance of global health has been my guest today, the former leader of the United States Senate, Bill Frist, MD. He was instrumental in persuading the Bush administration to allocate sizable budgets for global health, especially the fight against AIDS. And since stepping down in 2006, he has spent a good part of his time on issues in global health. Senator Frist, here's a bit of background information. He got his undergraduate degree from Princeton University in the 1970s. Then he went on to the Harvard Medical School and Stanford University, where under the renowned heart surgeon Norman Shumway, he trained to become one of America's foremost heart and lung transplant surgeons, a skill he practiced at Vanderbilt University in his native state, Tennessee. In 1994, he laid down his scalpel to run successfully for the Senate, where eventually he advanced to Majority Leader of the Senate. Having promised to serve in the Senate only 2 terms, Senator Frist stepped down from the Senate in 2006. Since then, he has been teaching at Princeton as the Frederick H. Schultz, Class of 1951, Visiting Professor of International Economic Policy. I am truly pleased and honored to have this special guest on our program today. Welcome, Senator Frist,
Thank you,
to International Forum.
I'm honored to be with you on the forum today.
When I invited you to come on the program, you suggest that we spend some time on the MCC, which I later then found out stands for Millennium Challenge Corporation. So we're going to talk about that. But then I did a little bit of research, and here's a bit of background that I'd like to share with the viewers first. This is about foreign aid, right?
Yeah.
The MCC.
Right.
Yeah. Now, traditionally, America, in terms of dollars, the dollar amount has been quite generous in giving foreign aid to the poor countries. But on a per capita basis and on a percent GDP basis, we have not been that generous.
Right.
And The Economist magazine had made that point several years ago. But several years ago, that changed, and that, I believe, has a lot to do with you and the establishment of the Millennium Challenge Corporation,
right.
the MCC.
Right.
So if you can please tell us what that is,
Right.
It's how it started, and what its mission.
Right. You know, it's interesting, and one of the reasons I think it is worth talking about is that it is a new innovation, a new almost experiment in the way the United States invests in countries, developing countries around the world, with the goal of reducing poverty through economic freedom, through economic development, through sustainability. You're exactly right. Historically, the United States, on a per capita basis, average it out across the number of people in this country, has been quite low through our government. Although we should be quick to remember that's doubled by our private giving here, which far out surpasses the charitable giving, the private giving, far out surpasses other countries on a per capita basis. But even putting that aside, it's low. And the reason it's low, in large part, is because as a United States Senator, when I would go back to Tennessee, over East Tennessee or in the Appalachian Mountains, people would basically say, why do you want to give money overseas where it never ends up on the ground? It never helps anybody. It is siphoned off in corruption, it's siphoned off in offshore, but it never gets to that school, or never gets to that clinic, or never gets to that patient. And I looked them in the eye, and they looked me in the eye, and I say, well, you're right. So what we did after the Monterey Summit, now about 6 years ago, back in 2002, the president came back and set up a Millennium Challenge Corporation. It's a unique organization whose goal is to reduce global poverty through economic development by focusing on three things. Number one, investing in people. Number two, good governance. And number three, economic freedom. And what it does, it takes the best of the public sector and the private sector, where senators and congressmen can't earmark to their favorite country, but basically they allocate money to the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a public-private entity. There's an 8-person board, and using objective criteria that have been proven by the world, global communities like the World Bank, like the WHO, using criteria, decide how to allocate that money on standards that are set and that are agreed to. Then, when I look at my constituent in the eye, and he or she says, listen, I'll give you that taxpayer dollar, and yes, you can send it overseas to fight poverty, but I want to hold you accountable for it, and I want it to be transparent. And now I can say that because this is standards-based, it's based on results, and with that, the American taxpayer is willing to give out more money to invest in reducing poverty around the world.
So what are the selection criteria?
Well, it's set up as this. It's set up not like a typical State Department program with a heavy bureaucracy. There's a CEO, a Chief Executive Officer. There are 8 board members. 4 of the board members are from the public sector, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of State, USAID, and the trade representative. Those are the 4. There are 4 from the private sector, 4 and 4, which are basically appointed by Congress and appointed by the President, have to be confirmed by the Senate. Those 8 people receive now up to $7 billion from government. They decide what countries to invest in. To date, there have been 17 countries that have received funds, and they received funds on 17 criteria. And the criteria, and it's worth talking just briefly about those, are in 3 sort of buckets. One is on governance and ruling justly. And with that, there are 4 criteria that fight corruption, have transparency in government, look at civil rights, look at human rights, and look at political rights. The second criteria, group of criteria, there are 6, and that is investing in people. Does this country invest in people? Their criteria are around health, their criteria around education, their criteria around women's issues or girls' issue in education and clean water. And the third group of standards, again, we'll talk about what these standards are, but the separate criteria, the third group is on economic freedom, accountability, transparency. And there we look at what a country is doing in terms of investment of issues like how long it takes to start up a business. What is the regulatory burden in that country? Are these businesses held accountable? By having criteria that are agreed upon by the international community, in each of those 3 areas, we require an applicant country to meet at least 50% of an average number that is determined by a group of countries that also fall in that category. So you can tell by the way I'm talking that it's standards-based. You have to show that you're moving to fight corruption, that you're moving to invest in health care, that you're moving in terms of economic development and accountability and transparency. If you show those good policies, and through the program we give you ownership of it, then you will get that money, and that money will allow you to promote that investing in people and that good governance and that ruling justly and sustainability. So it's an exciting program. It's still very early. It's only 4 years old. About $7.3 billion have been committed. We're just beginning to see the results from those programs now.
Yeah, well, we'll come to that. But first, let me ask you this. How is the MCC Millennium Challenge programs different from the traditional USAID directed type of foreign aid programs?
Great question. Because why do we need another program?
Right.
We have so many. We have PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Fund for HIV, AIDS, and malaria and tuberculosis. We have USAID, which operates within the larger State Department, and that's focused on humanitarian, responding to crisis. The great food crisis that we're undergoing right now with a doubling in food prices in the last 3 years. That demands an immediate sort of response, a humanitarian response. But there is no organization up until now, and that's why the Millennium Challenge Corporation was created, that focuses on those long-term projects of sustainability, things like infrastructure. USAID doesn't build a dam that can provide clean water when we know that you have to have clean water to have sustainable economic development. USAID doesn't do it. PEPFAR does not do it. So the idea...
Doesn't the World Bank do it?
And the World Bank does it to some extent, but the World Bank is doing 1,000 different things, and it really depends on what the priority. The World Bank is not based on these standards that we talked about. The World Bank does not give the country ownership, which is what the MCC does. Basically, the MCC doesn't say to a country, say Ghana, this is a program that we think you need. That's not part of the MCC. The MCC says you develop a program and tell us what you need in these 3 categories of governance, economic development, and investing in people.
Right. So I see now that the MCC, Millennium Challenge Corporation, does not replace the USAID, Agency for International Development.
Right.
But what is the relationship then between these 2 agencies?
It's another great question, because a new bureaucracy has been created, although it was created to be half private sector, half public sector.
I see.
And indeed, 150 people came over from the public sector to the MCC back in 2003 and 4, and 150 out of the private sector to marry the very best of the private sector to the public sector. The goal is to reduce poverty through long-term sustainable economic development. USAID is not. It is humanitarian response to a crisis, food, education, healthcare. The relationship, though, is an interesting one because there could be a competition. They're complementary, and the dollars that are added through MCC, they don't take away dollars from USAID or PEPFAR or the World Bank. It's critical they don't. These are additive dollars. But how do you integrate that? Well, of those 4 public sector people, 4 private sector people, it's interesting that one of those public sector people is the head of USAID. And therefore that person makes sure that there is a complementary relationship or a supplementary relationship and not a competition. So it's designed beautifully. And the private sector involvement is equal to the public sector. You have 8 people. And so the private sector out there, and I happen to be, in just full disclosure, I'm one of those private people, but I kind of pursued it a little bit because when I left Majority Leader of the Senate, after seeing all the problems that we have, the huge bureaucracies, I saw that this takes the very best of the innovation, of the creativity, of the ability to raise capital, of the partnering that's prominent in the private sector with the huge humanitarian aspects, the long-term thinking of the public sector, and it puts them together around the table, 8 people. Let me jump in just a second, add one last thing, because this is interesting. Senators don't like it very much. House members don't like it very much. And I was right in the middle of all that.
Because they can't touch it very much.
Can't touch it. You can't earmark. Basically, they say, here's $1 billion to these 8 people, or these 300 people, which is representative of thousands of people in the work from the global community. And that community is deciding based on strict standards, country ownership, results-based data of where the money goes. Very different than what a senator likes to do, sit back and say, I like the president of that country, let's give him or her $400 million. It takes that ability away. The senators and the legislators can't. So they don't like it. They don't like it very much. And in truth, they respect it, but it takes away some of that, I think, bad part of Washington, that earmarking.
Wonderful. That's really fascinating. Now, tell me about the main beneficiaries of these Millennium Challenge grants. Any country can go for it based on if they meet the criteria you just laid out for us.
High levels of poverty.
High levels of poverty. But so do most of the money go to African countries?
Well, a lot of it goes to Africa. No, also Latin America. And to give you sort of a range, it's really any developing country can apply. You're basically, say there's 6.5 billion people in the world. You're looking at the bottom billion people in the world in terms of economic development. Any country can apply. There's also a thing called Millennium Challenge effect, that once you make that application, then the world community kind of comes in and helps you and gives you advice on how to meet these standards. And then there's sort of an informal competition among these states, because we're all competing each other, because if you can get $400 million or even $100 million, it's a lot of money if you just focus on immunization or clean water or investing in schools or fighting corruption. So there's this kind of competition that is there among these poorest countries.
Let me just make this clear. I understand that the size of the grants is very large, right?
Yeah.
They range from 100 million to 300 million, 400 million.
That's correct. That's correct. And
so
this
really
is
do
a
something
lot.
with
Oh,
it.
it's huge.
Yeah.
It is huge, and it's additive. You know, some people said, well, if you're giving that way, you're taking away from elsewhere. That's not true. If you look at the overall development account, as you pointed out, over the last years, there's been a 40% increase in the overall account, which is huge. So everybody has gone up. So this is new money coming in on top of what people have gotten in the past. So it's not displacing. There's a big concern initially that if we give through the Millennium Challenge Corporation, you won't get as much money through PEPFAR or the President's Emergency Fund for malaria and HIV, or through USAID or other State Department programs. That is not true. This is in addition. I guess it's worth just to give a couple of examples so our viewers will know. In a country like, I'll be spending the summer in Mozambique. I'll be going down and part for the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And there is a huge commitment in terms of water. We know right now that the lack of access to clean water is probably the #1 killer of children under the age of 5 in that part of the world. We know that women are walking 3 hours a day just to get water for their family. It takes them away from their family and from being able to educate their children. But who's going to build a dam? Who's going to build these big structures? USAID doesn't do it. State Department doesn't do it. World Bank doesn't get involved directly. They will help do it. And so what the focus there in that application, which originates from the country, is clean water, and to be able to have an infrastructure there. Ghana, a great water project going on. Lesotho right now is doing a huge overall health program with the money in terms of immunization. Burkina Faso right now is working on girls' schools in establishing primary education, again, an investment early on, so we'll have long-term economic sustainability to pull out of poverty. These are the sorts of programs that we see underway today.
So I can see that you are getting the results that the program's objectives set out to achieve. In terms of rate on investment, I guess it's a little bit too early, right? I mean, they're now just laying the groundwork to make progress.
It is. That's going to be a real continued topic of discussion, because Congress right now will say, well, we have appropriated $7 billion, yet you've only put less than $1 billion out the door. Yet we've given you all this money, MCC, and you're not spending it. What a lot of people don't understand is that because one of the 3 fundamental principles, the principles are that policies matter in a country. If you're going to give a country money, their policies matter. Number 2 is that a country has to take ownership. Our traditional aid is what we think a country needs based on criteria that we see. This is different. We're saying, country, you plan for your dam. You plan for your roads. You pull together engineers. Yes, consult all of us, but it's got to be your plan. And then the third component is results matter. Coming back, we got to measure the results. So going back to that second point, we put the responsibility on the countries to learn how to build this infrastructure, give them the help, and that takes time. So you make an application to me, that may take 6 or 7 months. We evaluate that application, give you feedback, that may take 1.5 years. Then we give you the money, commit the money, say, let's say it's $5